My name is Jason Levin. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Applied Learning Science at Western Governors University. Today we're going to hear 3 different scientific perspectives on how to improve student outcomes. And at the end I'll talk a little bit about how our lab looks across those perspectives as well as others to try to build scalable products that work. First you'll hear from Omid Fatui, who is a social psychologist who specializes in motivation and performance. One of his premises is that people have a lot of maladaptive beliefs related to their education, and through simple messaging and institutional cues can make a big difference in student outcomes. Next you'll hear from Dr. Jennifer Talovich, who is also a social psychologist, and she specializes in neurocomputational models that predict behavior. And she's validated a model across several domains, most recently in education, that gives a lot of insights into where and how you might intervene. And finally, we'll hear from Diego Navarro, who's spent the last 15 years researching, studying, and a practitioner on how to improve outcomes in the most disadvantaged community college students. His approach is from sociology, and his premise is that poverty is a causal driver of childhood trauma that creates a lot of maladaptive beliefs, behaviors, and attitudes towards education that can be remediated through curriculum. So now I'll turn it over to Omid.
So Jason asked what your various roles are. Can I get a show of hands of who in the room is also a learner? What's interesting is that from social psychology, and I get to think about this stuff all day long, is trying to figure out how it is that our various identities play out in terms of predicting whether or not we engage or disengage. And one of the things that we take for granted is that we all actually occupy multiple identities. Right now I'm a speaker, I go home, I'm a father there, I'm a husband, I put on my running shoes, I think I'm a runner. And each of these domains, interestingly enough, has a component of evaluation with it, that we like to see ourselves as competent in these domains. But the way that we're wired is to protect our sense of self. And so if we feel like one of these domains might be potentially threatened, the way that we respond adaptively is to distance and defend against that threat. Unfortunately, in education, that really is the definition of the system that we've created. We're putting these students in a context where we're constantly telling them that they're wrong. There's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot of challenge, there's a lot of critical feedback, and yet we expect them to engage and stay engaged. That's kind of the dilemma that we're faced with. The question is, how do we make sure that we find that balance of allowing individuals to stay engaged while giving them the mental health that they need to function at a high level? One of the hallmarks of social psychology is that a lot of the information that we derive to understand ourselves and our social world actually comes from our contexts. The way that we see ourselves is based on the evaluation that we get, the feedback that we get. And for students, when we're asking them to put themselves at the frontiers of their ability, that place where they don't yet know something, that place where they're likely going to be wrong, they're likely going to be told that they have to do things in different ways, because that's where learning happens. You have to put yourself and be able to live in that space where you don't yet know something. And to be able to do that consistently for 2, 4, 6 years, there has to be trust. And so the question is, how do you instill a sense of trust in students to know that if they raise their hand, that they won't be judged in a way that is too critical of how they see themselves? Unfortunately, there are contextual factors, as I mentioned, that tend to work against this experience of trust. For many students in many groups, there is a phenomenon known as stereotype threat, which is whenever that you feel that one of your identities, and as I mentioned, and all of us occupy multiple identities, is potentially negatively viewed by other people, your defense mechanisms become activated. And so if you feel like you as a learner, as a student, are not seen in the same positive light as your peers, then that puts you in a state of threat, which again is aversive, and you are motivated to distance yourself from that experience. So if you're a racial minority, if you're first gen, and you look around and it seems like everybody else is sort of seamlessly doing well and fitting in and doesn't doesn't seem like they're struggling, but you see inside of you where you feel the frustration, you feel the uncertainty, and the question is, how do you make interpretations of that feeling? And if you're part of these negatively stereotyped groups, absent any other explanation, you're likely to say that maybe it is people like me who don't fit in. Maybe we can't do this. And that causes you to disengage. So this is one of the factors that we are mindful when we're recognizing that students, as they're navigating through their academic journeys, are often faced with questions of, is it me or people like me that can't do this? Do I belong? Am I smart enough? Is there a reason? And the explanations that you come up with in response to those questions predicts whether or not you engage or disengage. Oftentimes, for those who are contending with these negative stereotypes, they tend to make the more negative attributions. They tend to say, well, maybe it is something about me or my group. And that causes them to feel ashamed, that wants them to isolate themselves and not engage with the resources that are there that would allow them to actually do what they need to do, which is to learn. There's a phenomenon known as the Stanford Duck Syndrome, but I think it's a good metaphor for all freshman students. And essentially, a freshman student on a new campus will see themselves and other freshman students as these ducks. But what they see for other students that they don't see for themselves is that when they look around, they see these other students sort of seamlessly gliding across the surface of the water. But what they see for themselves is that they are paddling furiously to stay afloat. And what that causes people to do is they feel like there is something different about them that they can't speak up about, that they can't engage a professor about. And that makes them feel like they are different. So one of the things that we do is recognizing that these forces exist is that we try to find ways of overcoming these psychological barriers that tend to make people have more negative attributions or disengage so that they can stay engaged a little bit longer. Because we know that there are these recursive processes, that your past experiences, your expectations, feed into these loops. So let's say you get a bad grade in a math class. How you make meaning of that bad grade as either something that you didn't study for or an indication that you're not smart enough can determine which of these cycles you fall into. Because if you feel like this is evidence that you're not smart enough, then you become more vigilant for signs that confirm that initial fear, that maybe the studying is hard or your teacher is not responsive, which confirms the initial fear, and then you fall into this negative pattern of negative beliefs and negative outcomes that locks you into that. But instead, if you'd realized that a bad grade is simply a reflection of not having studied adequately, then that's a slightly positive attribution that gets you on this more positive trajectory. And so a lot of the interventions that we focus on are about identifying these key moments of attributional ambiguity so that you can nudge them to make more positive attributions in the face of challenge and difficulty. Now, I'll say this clearly because when things are going well, there is no attributional difficulty. You recognize that things are going well and you probably internalize the causes for that. But when things get hard, that's when you start to wonder, why is this happening? And if you make more negative attributions, then that's what predicts the disengagement that we often see. So the lines of programs that you can do to target these issues, one can fall into the category of these subjective psychological interventions that changes the lenses through which people make meaning. And a lot of the work that we do are sort of reflect that. So things like a growth mindset, belonging interventions, a purpose intervention, they equip people with slightly more adaptive attributions or interpretations for negative events so that they don't make those negative inferences. The other is not just assuming that you can solely rely on the subjective lens, but also recognizing the objective cues that people are exposed to. An example that comes to mind is if you're a woman, for instance, in an engineering program, and you're going into your class and you're walking down the hallway and there's picture after picture of old white guy, and you get into a class where you're one of 3 people and you want to go to the washroom and it's down this hall through an obscure sort of back way because it was an afterthought to put washrooms into this male institution, and you're getting a bad grade that day, then you start to see meaning in these potentially benign objective cues as well. And being more intentional and understanding the cues that we send, both in the sort of benign background messages, but also in the feedback that we give as educators, can help us understand the subjective perspective through which students make meaning of their day-to-day experiences. And then also just recognizing that we use language and meaning as a culture that we don't sometimes look at intentionally. So being able to challenge some of the implicit inferences that we have there. As part of the collaborations that we've been undertaking, both in this group and researchers across this domain, we recognize that there are some things that you want to focus on. Specifically, the tendency for this defensiveness is one of the barriers, in fact, because if you want someone not to do something, the best way to get them to do it is to tell them that they should do something and why they should do it. Ironically, we don't like to be told what to do. So how do you get around that? Well, there are some strategies, one of which is to avoid this deficit model, to avoid thinking that the people that you're there to help are in need of help, which is challenging, but there are ways that you can do it. And you also want the message to feel authentic and internally derived. How do you do that? Again, there are strategies. One of the tools that we use is the saying is believing paradigm, where we get people to write through their own words, through their own perspectives, what the events mean to them. Timing is crucial. As these inferences have time to become solidified, then it's much more difficult to change as opposed to early on when there is still the ambiguity. So recognizing the potential pain points that students encounter and timing the intervention specifically to those moments can optimize your chances of doing it well. And then the question of scaling is something that we're all sort of thinking about, I think, in this room and on this panel. How do you create a program that is based on research and then deliver that to institutions, to educators, in a way that they can, with fidelity, implement it in an effective and persistent way? And there is a science and an art to that, one of which I think is just recognizing that the agents, the individuals who become the delivery mechanisms have to understand the student's perspective, the subjective construals that they function on, so that they understand on a general way how it is that these students make and react to the different events in their lives. So I think I'll stop there and hand it over to Jennifer to tell you a little bit about her work as well. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Let's see. All right. My name is Jennifer Talovich. I'm currently the Director of Research at CALS, WGU. I got my PhD in computational social psychology at the University of Southern California. The majority of the body of work that I've built thus far has been in systems-level self-regulation and motivation. I've also worked in VR and games. So today, I'm going to introduce you to a theory that I love very much, and it's computational implementation. Then I'll show you how the model shows us opportunities for intervention. This is going to be the majority of what we'll talk about today. And then I'll show you just one slide on the human data and how it predicts outcomes. So behavioral systems theory was developed in the 50s by John Bowlby, and it rose to prominence in the 70s. And has continued to generate volumes of research in social psychology as well as developmental psychology. A behavioral system is an evolved system. It's holistic. It's interconnected and interacting perceptions, motivation, emotion, and behavior. It explains both situational responding and how, over time, this becomes ingrained as chronic behavior. So if you see someone who's acting in a way that doesn't seem consistent with the environment and the opportunities that they have, they're probably stuck in this chronic behavior cycle. So it seeks to show who, how, and when people seek or avoid close relationships, novelty, altruism, and positions of power and how they'll behave in those positions. And right now, I'm applying the framework to learning science, so that would be the learning behavioral system. So Bowlby gave us a wonderful book with chapters on emotion, motivation, the environment, but what it isn't is connected. at least not in a very precise way. And he can't be faulted for this. In the 50s and 60s, we didn't have the information. But now we do. We have decades of psychological research, neuroscience, and the new field of complexity. So what I've built is a neurocomputational model. It's an artificial intellect implementing behavioral systems theory. I've confirmed the model, the structure, in 6 human data studies. I'm currently working on the 7th, and in 4 domains. So I'm going to whip through it super fast, beyond comprehension. Don't try. We'll come back. Okay? So we have features of a situation, and these converge on the perceived situation. This is what activates a motivation system. Once we've got motivation going on, then the emotion comes in, and then finally emotion is a trigger for behavior. Then behavior and what caused it is fed back into the model so that on the next iteration, we have everything occurs within the context of what occurred last time and how we felt about it. So this is learning over time. All right, perceptions of the situation. So in the model, it specifically lists threat, who is there, what are they doing, and what did they do last time. And these are the perceptions of the situation, which of course can have a lot of bias based on the learning. And here we can intervene on these connections with reframing and attribution theory. CALS has actually developed 4 modules that work on these connections, authored by Omid here. So once we have a situation being perceived, this activates motivation. What do you want to achieve in this situation? And we can intervene on these connections by decreasing the value of educational conflicting goals, such as avoiding failure, which is a very prominent goal, believe it or not, and increase the value of educational goals and achievement and what that can do for your other life goals. In addition to what we want to achieve is can we? So we have these layers that will check for each goal the congruence of achieving that goal with the situation. And we can intervene on these connections by increasing the perceived likelihood of achieving educational goals or other life goals with an education and decreasing the likelihood of fulfilling them without. Okay, so once we have all the goals and the activations, these then converge on the goal impact compute layer. And this is just a pattern that represents the situation, the motivational state as a whole. In the human data, and you can see from this reference, this is where I've actually built a tool that will help you measure each of these different assessments for your students and then aggregate and create a single composite to represent the state of the motivation system. And that can be easily plugged into your statistical models. And it's highly predictive. So goal impact can be thought of simply as how is the situation, there being a student at your institution, affecting the rest of their lives and the rest of their life goals. So motivation then activates emotion and emotion behavior. And we can intervene on these 2 connections with mindfulness meditations between the motivation and the emotion, and then interrupt automatic emotion processing before it gets to behavior. So just because you're angry doesn't mean you have to hit that guy. So here, very briefly, is the model. I've run this with 400 students, operationalizing each of the layers, and we find that indeed the, let's see, does it have, oh, it doesn't have the numbers. Contact me. I will get you all the numbers involved here, but the model, the structural equation model does have excellent fit, and we do see serial mediation whereby specific motivations are mediating between the goals and the behaviors, and the model as a whole is predicting the number of credit hours that our students completed. So please connect with me. Let's brainstorm ideas and grant opportunities. And you can find me on LinkedIn as well as ResearchGate. Let's see.
Thank you, Jennifer. So my portion of this talk is about hope. Hope that this will not buzz at us. But really hope about students that underperform in college. I've been working in the community college system since 2002, so it's about 17 years. And 66% of incoming students in the community college system are underperforming or unprepared for college. And 43% of these students usually leave college between the fall and the spring. So we have a huge attrition of students that come into our colleges. And what I'm going to be talking about in this portion of the talk is social theory model that's focused on student formation, because what we did back in 2002 is start to look at how do we address the issues of students from poverty. I was focusing in a community called Watsonville on students that were disconnected from education, disconnected from employment. Watsonville is a small town, 80% Latino, in the south part of Santa Cruz County. We've now scaled it into Salinas, which is 90% Latino community, and inner city Oakland and Richmond. So the data I'm going to be showing you in terms of outcomes are about students that are from different backgrounds, but of tough backgrounds, many of them. And so one of the things that we've noticed over time in this work is that our students come in with a certain type of perspective, an experience of education, and I'm not going to talk about this today, but the industrialization of education is really critical to understand because our students are coming into our classroom as adults from an experience they had, and if you recreate that experience, they go into trauma effect from that a lot of the time. So you have to be really aware of that. But what I'm going to talk about in a moment is about a study that Stanford did a number of years ago where they were looking at trauma, degrees of trauma, and they were looking at returning Iraqi and Afghan war veterans because they wanted to see if these combat veterans, what are we going to be faced with them coming back into our society. They developed this instrument and they normed it with these returning combat veterans, and then they had the idea, well, why don't we take that instrument and go into an inner city elementary school and use it on those students. So they went into an inner city elementary school, and guess what they found? They found that in the United States, inner city young people, elementary school students, have twice the level of PTSD symptoms than returning combat veterans. So we're dealing not only with the industrialization of education, we're dealing with issues that our students are raised with in their neighborhoods, on their way to school. There's a number of things that they're facing that lead to these types of, well, I call it the scourges of poverty. And these students are coming to our classroom. So what do we do about that? So this talk is really about how we can actually work with these students and work effectively with them. As I mentioned before, I've been doing this work since 2002. We've done 7 longitudinal studies that have been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, a lot of the big funders, because they found that this is a very effective methodology using a social theory approach. And we've replicated outcomes at scale, which I'll show you some of those. And currently, with the support of Jason and WGU, we've been scaling it online in a hybrid environment of both synchronous and asynchronous teaching. We've had 25,000 students go through one of the courses. We're enrolling about 1,800 a month. So that's a lot to say in one slide, but the other ones will go a little bit faster than this one. So college readiness is the first thing I wanted to talk about. There are different types of readiness. One is academic readiness, and when I started this program in 2002 and began this research, I found that community colleges focused on this solely. Academic readiness for underprepared students. They didn't look at other issues around that. And then what started to happen was in 2012, an interesting study came out of the University of Chicago by a woman named Camille Farrington. And she was looking at, she did a lit review, and she found that there were 5 different areas of affective, or what's called affective non-cognitive learning. And one of them had to do with habits and behaviors. So what are the habits and behaviors that you have being effective in school? Mindsets and self-efficacy. Another, social skills, learning strategies, persistence. There's a number of fields, a number of areas. And so when we talk about affective learning, we're talking about a complex series of things. And career readiness is about showing up and doing the work. It's also behavioral in some sense. But also more professional type skills like collaboration students need. So about in 2015, I went on sabbatical. Thank goodness my college provided that for me. And I received an appointment at the Carnegie Foundation for Advancement of Teaching at Stanford. They'd been doing this work on affective learning in 2009, and they'd invited me back then to be on their advisory panel since I'd been doing this work for 7 years before they started that work. And so they invited me to be a visiting scholar there for a year. And when I was there, I started to find, as I interviewed a number of people, experts throughout the field, throughout the country, and that's where I got to meet Omid in one of my interviews with him, but with a number of people out there, David Yeager and others. And I found that there was two approaches to affective, non-cognitive, and experiential learning. One is focused on, and they have different goals. One focuses on the goal of retention and attrition. So how do we retain our students, and what can we do to retain those students? So the outcomes are focused on that. There's another approach, which I call the social theory approach, and it focuses on an experience the student has that's complete. So how do you create a leader? And you give them leadership skills, but you do it affectively or non-cognitively using experiential learning. So their goals are different. The outcomes are very similar. When we look at the research, their academic outcomes, their psychological construct outcomes are very similar. They're based on different theories. One's based on psychological theory. The other one's based more on social theory. And they're applied in the classroom differently. One is what I call time slice. So you take a 20-minute exercise and you do it in your psychology class. You do a 15-minute exercise in your math class, and now you're inoculating your student against growth mindsets, or you're actually not inoculating them against that, but you're trying to, switching it around. So there's these different approaches. So psychological actually is more time sliced, where the sociological or the social theory approach is focused on experiences in the classroom of teaching them leadership skills, communication skills, and through that actually having an effect on them. So it's important that we look at these different approaches because they both are complementary and they're very supportive of each other. So one of the things that I found with working with these students for a number of years is that their lives are very complex and their needs are complex. And so I met this first student. I'm going to have her talk in a moment in a video. I met her in adult school. I found some of my best students came from adult school because they were trying to change their lives. She came to the community college because she wanted to be a role model for her children. She was scared and didn't think she could do college. And as I dug deeper with her, saying, what's going on, Anna? Why don't you feel you could be at community college? I found out this story. She'd come across the border with her mother and her sister, her older sister, and they ended up in Arizona for about, I guess about a year. They felt like the Migra was coming after them, the immigration services. Now, this is not today. This is a while ago. She was 28 by the time I met her. And so they moved to Southern California, and they had the same experience there. So they moved to Watsonville. And so they were in Watsonville. They had this big party when she was in 8th grade because she was the first person in her family to graduate from 8th grade. A year later, during her quinceañera, she found out that she was pregnant. So in 9th grade, she dropped out of school, and I met her like 13 years later. She was 28 years old. She was burnt out. She had been working 2 jobs. She had 4 children by that point, and she was trying to figure out a way to develop skills that would allow her to have employment that wouldn't require 2 jobs. And so that's when I met her at the adult school. Her name's Anna.
I learned about myself. I learned what to expect from me. What else could I do to get my kids out from the hole I was? And I said, you know what? I'm going to do this. I'm going to make this. I can make it. I know I can.
So what I found in talking with her was that she never went to high school because she dropped out after she was pregnant. So she thought since she didn't go to high school, she couldn't go to college. And luckily, we'd already had 1 semester of work with our students and found that you didn't really need to have high school to be effective in college because you had an adult brain. And we were using methodologies that would allow the students to take their life experience and bring it into the classroom and utilize that to learn math and to learn English. And so what I learned from her and other students is that they're like blades of grass going through the concrete. I mean, they have survival and persistence skills and strengths that when I talked to other educators before I started the program, they'd say, oh, these students, they're very weak in persistence. They drop out. And I find out It's actually the opposite. These students have strength and persistence. What we have to do is build a bridge for them to take that strength and apply it to higher education, dealing with some of the things that Omid was talking about in terms of stereotype threat and those types of approaches within what I call a social theory model. So the model is this. You have entry to college. And my college, the way they do entry is you do an online orientation. It takes you half hour, 45 minutes to do. Well, if you go to some of the elite liberal arts colleges like Swarthmore and Amherst or Haverford, those colleges, their orientation is at least a week long because they know to become this person that's going to be going to this intense school, you need to develop these capacities within yourself to identify being there, belonging with the group. They do all these things with them. And in community college, I would argue, our students have a much bigger leap to make than they do in these elite schools. And we spend 15 minutes to 45 minutes on an online orientation. Well, what I found in my research, we did 5 pilots the first year and a half. These pilots were 40 hours long in the classroom with students. I thought I would take them and do rope courses and stuff outside and overnight types of experiences, because that's what I'd been doing in the 70s. But what I found was that the Latino fathers wouldn't let their daughters or Latino teenage daughters go overnight anywhere. So we had to learn how to do this in the classroom. So we designed this so that this turned out to be an 8-day immersion. We started out piloting it for 5 days. I looked at 36 different curriculum, narrowed it down to 9, and started piloting those curricula to see what lit a fire inside of students and would address these issues. Getting them to believe they can do it, lighting the fire for learning, know they belong here, develop collaboration skills, and learn other 21st century skills, because I felt they need to be prepared for the world, which is professional jobs. How do we build that into the curriculum? So it's fundamental. Once you create that capacity inside the students, and I call it the capacity to suffer, because many of our students suffer when they go to school. They hear these voices saying, you're not smart, you didn't do well, many of the things that my colleagues were talking about that students experience in the classroom. How do you help them overcome that? And we found in 2 weeks you can do that. We did a study of 769 students using psychological constructs and found that we could shift all of them except for one in 2 weeks at a 0.001 level of statistical significance. And that's not part of this presentation, but that's another part of the study that we did. Then from there, we put them into a course that we call Team Self-Management, and on a regular basis, have them wake up. Because many of our students are in trances. So if they're underprepared for college, it's usually because they've developed habits and behaviors that keep them from being successful in college. But they don't know what they do, so they can't do what they want. So they come out of this first course, I'm on fire, I'm going to be a straight A student, I know where I'm going to go. You put them into academics, guess what? They're looking at their goal and they're walking in that direction, and they don't know it. So you have to wake them up. They have to become aware of what they're doing. We have a number of curricula that lead students through that process. We're actually implementing it now online at WGU. So we're going to show that you can actually do it online as well. And then from there, you have them cocooned within an academic program. And ours was based on social justice research. So here's another student, Gloria. And her experience of her younger life affected how she saw herself and saw herself in what she could do with her life, and she talks a little bit about that.
When the first 2 weeks were done, I had no doubt that I could accomplish my goals of becoming a nurse. I wanted to first start as a medical assistant, and then I wanted to become a nurse. And I can't even express to you guys like just the desire that he had lit in me, just to want to learn, to want to continue. Like, wow, I can do this. The grass is starting to look greener for me. Every time, like, the grass would look greener on the other side, that saying. Well, that's how I've always felt, especially from my background of what I had seen, I would be envious about other people, like, oh, I want to be like them, I want to be like them. Well, now I'm, like, so excited to be me, It's like, oh, here I am young, I'm still young, I'm trying to do this goal, I'm trying to accomplish it, and I feel like I am going to.
So the social theory approach is about student formation. It's about the student forming who they are, and many of our students come in unclear about that. I had a student who was very good at robotic work, and he just came in and built these robots for us in one of our pilots. And after class, I went up to him and said, you should be going to community college. He said, I can't go. And I said, why? He said, I have dyslexia. I said, you have dyslexia? How do you know that? He said, my second grade teacher told me I had dyslexia. And I said, did you ever get tested for it? No. Okay, so we have students that really don't know who they are, and we've got to focus on the rites of passage and forming them into, whoops, oh, that's how I turn that on. Sorry. So the model includes not only those two pieces, but we have a social justice curriculum. It's primary research, because we found that with secondary research, it requires higher literacy skills. But primary research, where you're thinking through research questions, developing surveys, if you're an expert on your topic, and my students are experts on social injustice, they know what it's about, why students join gangs. They know why youth use drugs. They know a number of these things. We teach them the methodology to actually express what they're learning, and then they have a data set. They usually go out and interview 150 people, survey them, and then they've got a data set. They want to learn statistics, and we teach them that. So it's a model that accelerates them. This is one of the studies. I'll go through it very quickly. This was, the Gates Foundation funded this based on a study that Columbia University did, the Community College Research Center. Davis Jenkins was the PI, did a study of my program at the very beginning with the N of 66. They showed that our students did better than the control group by 134%, but the N was so small that they felt they couldn't rely on it. So then the Gates Foundation found that study. They funded this study of 4 colleges, 1,000 students using the same curriculum. It wasn't the Diego effect, because I wasn't teaching all those students. And they found actually the same thing, about instead of it being 134% difference, at 128% difference when other teachers were teaching it. And this is passing their transfer level English class 1 semester after the intervention, the 1 semester program. We also studied doing math acceleration and English acceleration at the same time. This is the type of outcomes that you see when you're doing that using the social theory model. And then we started to work with nurses. We found that you could work with students that were prepared for college. And so we implemented a course, a 1-week, 5-day course for nurses. And this was first implemented in 2010. And we wanted to look at, well, what is the labor effect, labor statistic effect? So what's their salary difference? We looked at longitudinally 6 years later, and they found that with these students, and the control group was the nurses that didn't take that 1-week course. And it was interesting, at this college, they switched over to this 1-week course in 2010. So everybody before didn't have it, and everybody afterwards took the intervention. And they found 6 years later, this in terms of salary difference. It was actually close to a $40,000 median salary difference. Now, there's a number of issues we could talk about why that's the case, and this looks quite dramatic, but at some point, if you're interested, we could talk more about what that was. But that's pretty much my part of the presentation.
Yeah. So there's a lot of good work, as you can see, going on different academic institutions by different researchers across the country that leads us to believe there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of opportunity to scale high-quality outcomes in education. And based on that insight, about a year ago, WGU founded a new nonprofit, the Center for Applied Learning Science, affectionately called CALS, designed to take advantage of those perspectives you heard today and more. We're looking for big challenges in education with no clear solution, but some body of research to indicate where we want to build. So how do we work? The basic thesis is if we can bring scientific rigor, user-centered design, agile development, rapid prototyping and testing cycles to education technology, we can rapidly innovate and improve outcomes for students. The way we do that is we've formed cross-functional teams that can take a problem statement from beginning to end and solve a real learning challenge. These teams are led by a role we call Learning Experience Designer. This is a hard role to find. We're looking for someone with formal training in learning science and social psychology, as well as human-centered design and UI UX. We do have the capacity to train on one or more of those domains if we find someone who doesn't have all 3. They lead a team, and we start the Learning Experience Designer with a hunt statement or a problem statement. And they approach, the problem statement could be, why are students failing in math? And they would do a literature review, they'd look at products that are out there, they'd talk to students, they could do primary and secondary data analysis. And they come up with potential solutions which they take in front of students in increasing levels of fidelity. And once we have confidence that a solution will be successful, we engage the content and engineering team. So we have a team of engineers, multimedia artists, and content writers who can take a design concept from beginning to end to a deployable product. We back these teams with data science and research expertise, as well as a network of subject matter experts like the folks you heard from today. We build all our technology to be mobile-first design, to be standards-based integrated into LTI integration into LMS. And they're designed to be self-contained modules for students to go through that are engaging and effective. We instrument all of our technology with XAPI data collection, standards-based data collection. So that's for every transaction, it's recording who is the actor, the student, what did they do, did they watch a video, did they answer a question, and what did they do to the subject, what piece of content or learning objective were they on. We endeavor to evaluate all of our products with randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials are difficult to do in education for a couple of different reasons. One of them is functional. We built a little piece of technology to get over that functional difficulty. We call it the randomizer. It's basically an LTI link that will a single LTI link can fit into any LMS or student environment. And when a student comes through that link, it'll evaluate, have I seen the student before? If they have, it'll send them back to where they were. If we haven't seen them before, it'll determine if they go into a treatment or control environment. They'll either receive treatment content or placebo content. We've actually developed 4 educational placebo content, which are experiences that are interesting and benign enough not to create a positive or negative emotional response. So far, we've developed 4 self-contained modules to get at different maladaptive beliefs in education. Each one is expected to take about 15 to 20 minutes of time. We have in the field live randomized controlled trials going on right now with all 4. So what have we built to date? Our first module we call Learning with Time. This is to address the belief that just because something's taking you a long time doesn't mean you're not smart or that you won't learn it. And that just because something's difficult today doesn't mean it'll be difficult for you always. The example we use there is driving a car. Everybody probably remembers when you first learned to drive a car, it was very difficult, it was scary. Now you're probably driving around, texting your friends. The next one we call mistake mindset. This is to get over the misbelief that just because you're making a mistake doesn't mean that you're not learning or you're not smart. Mistakes are a part of learning. To learn, you have to make mistakes. The third one is learning mindset. This is a very traditional growth mindset intervention. We have paired that with not just effort, but effective strategies. And we give examples of a couple effective learning strategies students can engage in. And the last module is math anxiety. It's going to be part of a larger suite of math mindset type products, but one thing we uncovered through our research is that anxiety and ability are not perfectly correlated. So there's a number of students who just have a single blocker of being anxious about math. We use 2 techniques, normalization. We show students data we collected that a lot of students have math anxiety, and attributional retraining. We explain the evolutionary reason for anxiety and how it actually means you care and it is important to your success. The way Omid spoke a little bit about how do you get students to really internalize this content. Just telling them that they need to do it will probably create a defense mechanism that they don't think they need an intervention. One of the techniques we do is we frame it as, hey, we need your help. We think we have some content that might help students. Can you please go through it and phrase how you might describe it to students? So we're open for business. We're looking for people who are interested in partnering with us on like projects. So thank you. I think now we'll I guess we'll take questions either from the audience or online. So I guess maybe we'll phrase this question to the panel. How important do you believe resiliency and developing resilience in schools you work with is?
So I'll comment on that. I mentioned as the the third category of approaches that we tend to focus on, which has to do with culture, meaning, and language. This is a prime example. When you think of resilience, what you're essentially trying to foster or cultivate is the ability to persist when your resources are depleted, which is a bit of a contradiction. Because when you think of it, when you have nothing left, how can you endure more? How could you go on? There's a lot of debate, but at the core of why I find this an interesting example is because all too often in all of our roles, we rely on these deficit models as the individual students having to take the entire onus of trying to improve their own lives. And when you really think of resilience, it's not an individual level trait, it's actually a systems trait. That when you are depleted, when you're running low on resources or energy or motivation, that you can rely on your networks to draw on their pooled resources so that you can get over whatever hump you're going through. I do think that there is this, hype currently with grit and resilience that we're noticing as part of a national conversation. The question is, what impact is that having on our students? Is that the right angle or the right approach in terms of thinking about these individual level traits? And what are the consequences? From my perspective, I think resilience is incredibly important, but recognizing that resilience comes from a supportive network, not relying on individuals to just grit it out, because that might actually lead to maladaptive interpretations or experiences that in the long run may not be sustainable. But it is a really important topic of research and development, so I do encourage more work in this domain. I say that because there are also limiting beliefs where people don't fully tap into their full potential. And I think when this research emerged, it was in recognition that a lot of people disengaged too early, and that if they learned to just overcome the psychological barriers that prevents them from staying engaged, then that is in fact the manifestation of resilience. So there is two parts to this conversation. I think they're both really important.
The only thing I'll add to that is I think resilience is like a combination of a lot of different underlying factors: volition, self-efficacy, attribution, expectancy. So it kind of, in my opinion, it muddies that too much to be able to effectively intervene in it. I think I had a question.
So how'd you work with that support and network and engagement in an online environment? How'd you apply that?
Yes, so we are looking for research partners, so people who want to do randomized controlled trials of our products, or people who are just interested in becoming subscribers to the catalog of apps we have.
Did you mean students' sense of belonging and feeling supported? Okay. So we actually, Diego, you might want to take that one.
Sure. So we have this one course, it's the one being ready for college, and as I mentioned earlier, we've had 25,000 students go through it now. And what it's really focused on is about building the capacity for students to care for one another and building community with them, as well as 21st century skills. But you're really building the capacity of a group, what I call suffer together, communities of suffering. That's kind of how I've imagined it, even though with nurses it's a different kind of suffering that they go through. But what happens is that I did this pilot in Oakland, inner city Oakland, with faculty. I was training, my second summer of training of faculty. And we had this young woman sharing her story about her background, her life. And at the end of it, she started crying because something happened in her life, and she was just sort of feeling a little bit raw at that point. And I noticed as we took a break that all the faculty ran to her and they surrounded her. And the students started wandering off, and I started going, uh-oh, this is weird. So I pulled the faculty together because I was training faculty, and I said, next time, do not go up to the student, stand against the wall. Notice if a student goes up to them, and if they start to surround her or him, and they go out together. If not, find the people with mothering skills and point out to them, you might want to go talk to this person, help them build the community. Once you start building a community, there's strength that happens there. They know each other's phone numbers. They call each other at 3 in the morning. I won't be awake usually at that time to answer their phone numbers. They are amazing in terms of how they pull each other through. Well, we've done this online now. We have students where we're doing synchronous types of classrooms where the students get to know each other. We take them through these experiential learning exercises, and now they have this bond that allows them to pull each other through. And so it's very effective, but it requires, at least at this point, synchronous communication.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of overhead with that. So right now we are looking at different ways of enhancing a sense of belonging and ways that we can have the students communicate and connect more in an asynchronous manner. So that's a matter for ongoing research.
So a question, how would you communicate the benefits of learning science to parents? It's a really good question. It's a hard question to answer, the benefits of science. So, I mean, I would do the correlation between medicine and education. So medicine is a field that's advanced substantially over the last 100 years, where education, you can make the argument, is done a lot in the same way. And I think that's because one of the reasons is because of medicine's commitment to science, doing randomized controlled trials, because we really don't know if things are going to work or not. And so the only way to really know is to deploy high-quality research methods. I think we do way too much quasi-experimental work in education, and it's holding the field back.
I think you had a question?
Yeah, this is more from like kind of like a community college type environment, kind of for, maybe more for Diego. But how did you talk about training faculty on this social theory and kind of getting buy-in from the faculty that a lot of times in community college spaces are already stressed or overworked or underpaid, and how to get them to really buy into that piece of the social theory?
So an example was at Merritt College, which serves inner city Oakland students. And so the vice president of academic affairs and the president were very interested in the outcomes that we had and said, we'd like to work with our students in this way. So I said, pull together your faculty. Select the faculty you think that might be open to this, but open it to everyone else that wants to come. So usually they pull the faculty together and you do a presentation about affective experiential learning, and you have stories about students, and they start to see the data that what they're facing with the high attrition rates doesn't necessarily have to be that way, and you can do it through connecting with the students from the heart in terms of your experience. So you lay this out, and then what I said to them, to the faculty is, your administration's thinking about doing this, but they're not going to do it unless you want to make this happen. So you have to call your president and let her know. And so her phone was, everybody started calling her, and so then they set up this training. But you have to go directly to the faculty and let them see that there's hope, because a lot of faculty go to the community college because they want to reach out to these types of students. Then they show up in the classroom. It's like Teach for America. A lot of the Teach for America teachers go out and they do Teach for America, and then they leave teaching altogether. We were with a Lyft driver that was talking about his experience doing that, because it's very hard, and it's very disconcerting to watch students fall away from your cognitive approach to teaching the subject you really love. So when they see there's hope, faculty start to turn around.
There's a couple of questions online, and then we'll go to the audience. So we'll be making the slides available. There's no reason why I wouldn't. Feel free to send them out. I'm not sure if there's a way to upload them, but if you're interested, please email me. I'll definitely send them. Are the apps you mentioned suitable for K-12 kids? I mean, there's nothing that would be not suitable for them, but the examples and the characters we created are much more geared towards adult learners and community college students. And so if we'd be interested to try those, we'd have to probably change the examples and the characters.
I think some of the recordings, but I think a lot of the content is actually very appropriate for high school at least.
Yeah. There's nothing inappropriate, certainly. It's just whether or not it would resonate, I think, is the point. Do you partner with industry corporations in any way to enable skill development workforce? No, not yet, but that's something that we are thinking about, how to branch into that. And are the apps available for public download? Not yet, but if you're interested in trying them, please send me an email and we can work something out.
So I work in adult education. It's very lovely to have people mentioning adult education. But I'm a professional developer, and I work with teachers to help them think about how to integrate technology. And so many of the things you're describing resonate with my experience of teaching teachers about using technology and their fears, and assuming that they're the only one who doesn't know how to do it or whatever. And I'm just wondering if you could talk more about professional development around this. You mentioned a little bit about talking to teachers or helping teachers see how to bring this in.
Well, I'll start, and I know that Omid and Jennifer will have something to say too about this, but what I found, and this was reinforced the year I was doing the visiting scholar work at Carnegie, was that to teach faculty to teach from an experiential learning model or an affective model, they have to go through it themselves. So both Carnegie Foundation and the work that we do is we take the faculty through that experience because they have master's degrees, they have PhDs, but all of it was seeing role models of cognitive teaching. So they don't really have a barometer inside themselves to understand what is it that we're trying to do that they've never experienced before. So we have a 5-day training. It's called the 5-Day Experiential Learning Institute. We're doing one in a couple weeks. And what it is, it's a 5 days, 9 to 5, or 8:30 to 5, and faculty go through the experience that the students do. But the students are, how do we reconceptualize our lives to actually be creating the world we want? With faculty, we change it. We say, how do we change our community colleges, our adult ed environment, so that students thrive? So it's a different trajectory, but the same curriculum we take them through. And then by the time they come out of that, they understand what experiential learning is, and it's not teaching them cognitively, because we could go through and talk about, stereotype threat, and I have a lot of, and we all have a lot of work around training around the cognitive approach to this, but it's an experiential approach, which most faculty don't have, is that experience. So we take them through that.
Can I just add to that? I think we're all, when we began, we're all learners. We all have these identities that, again, we protect ourselves from when we feel we're threatened. And I do think that that's sort of the elephant in the room a lot of the times, that faculty are also impacted by some of these psychological experiences that causes them to disengage, and understanding the forces at play that maybe shelters them or prevents them from opening up can be a really great place to start. So when we do professional development work, a lot of the times we focus on the similar themes that we typically create interventions for, because they themselves are motivated agents that are trying to achieve certain goals. And admittedly, many of them face daily struggles and setbacks in terms of they're not seeing the impact. And I actually feel like I have so much respect for educators, because it's one of the few professions where they invest so much and see so little evidence of the impact of what they're doing. Because when the students do go on to become successful, they're not around anymore. And so how do you shift the perceptions of faculty to recognize and appreciate the value and impact that they're having in an agentic way, in a way that is adaptive, in a way that doesn't arouse those defense mechanisms and some of the psychological biases and experiences that students have, faculty also struggle with. So there's a paper that you might want to look at. It just came out in Science Advances by Mary Murphy and her team that looks at the impact of faculty's, of the students' mindset being predicted predominantly by their faculty's mindset. So and this was especially true for underrepresented racial minorities. So if a faculty believes that students' capacity and potential is limited, then that becomes manifested in implicit and indirect ways that the students pick up on. And so how do you impact student success? Well, you make sure that the faculty have the most adaptive mindsets to begin with. And how you instill that is multi-pronged, multi-dimensional, but it is an important point. All too often, I think faculty are shielded against these kinds of conversations and these experiences, but I think it's a critical part of the conversation. Sorry to, please.
I just had we run a tech school, and oftentimes our educators are tradesmen, but they don't have the training in education. So they don't have the degrees, they don't have the bachelor's and master's degrees. So we find often that our educators and our students are in the same mindset, really. One's learning how to teach and one's learning how to learn, and we have to go in there in our department, we do faculty training. We have to show them an example in their field on how some of those things work before we can get buy-in from them. Otherwise, they don't want to hear it. I've been teaching aircraft for 20 years, and I don't even know this, but yeah, you do. So we show them, and then that's how we get buy-in from them, is to show them an example in their particular field, nothing else, their field, and we're able to get them to move forward and get themselves out of their comfort zone, so to speak.
We did a very similar type of a training. We were working with Cal State University East Bay, which is a highly diverse student population. And the Science College had high attrition rates with students of color. So they asked us to come in and to work with their science faculty. So what they did was they chose 11 faculty, each from one discipline that the Science College focuses on. So we had 11 faculty. They were called fellows from their discipline. And we did 3 4-hour workshops with them using articles that come from research in using affective approaches to science and math. And we trained them cognitively and then trained them affectively. After the first workshop, they tried some of the exercises in their classes. And then we came back together the next quarter and they talked about their experience in the classroom. Then we took them to a deeper level of understanding how to do these exercises. And then they started to apply it to their discipline. And by the third workshop, they were going into their departments and they were starting to train their departments on using these approaches for chemistry, using these approaches for whatever area that they were working in. So it's similar to what you're saying. You need to apply it to their area and they need to understand how it affects their discipline.
And it becomes infectious.
Yes.
Once you can get one guy or gal on that train, then oh, how did that work? And then they're training each other, which is fantastic.
Is where you want to go.
The only other thing I'll mention really quickly is being a father, I realize how little my children pay attention to me and how much they do pay attention to their teachers and their friends. And sometimes there's actually value in having external groups provide some of this training. At least that's an observation I've found. So if that's helpful.
So I think we're at time. Thanks for coming.